I want you to have questions and chat, to have a proper full-on discussion and chat. So please use the chat function to put up your questions, and throughout the course of the evening, John will call you out and ask you to ask your question or raise your question. So, you know, what we're going to discuss tonight is how COVID's affected the arts, but also, more importantly, in one sense, how important the arts are to Australia's economy and how important our creative industries are to Australia's economy and our cultural well-being. Now, for those people who are Labor supporters, we often think that it was Gough Whitlam who was the first person that really put creative industries and arts on the agenda for Australia and really made it a policy position for Labor to fully support. But that's not quite right. As we've been going back through the Chifley archives, Daniel, who runs our technical side, and myself, we discovered a video from Frank Ford, who was not only the shortest lived Prime Minister in Australian history, but back in 1931, he was the Minister for Customs and Trade. And we'll just show that video now before we get underway completely, because it shows that support for Australia's creative industries actually goes back a long way and is very much in the Labor blood. So,
ladies and gentlemen, I deem it quite an honour to appear before you this evening as Minister of State for Trade and Customs to introduce to you an all-Australian talkie program produced by FT Film Studios for the entertainment of Australian picture lovers. The production of this program marks a new era in Australian industries. The wonderful progress made in the motion picture industry from the days of the silent film to modern talkies is indeed a romance. The cinematograph has captured the popular imagination as an entertainer and as an educator. There is no other form of entertainment that appeals so much to the rising generation. We send nearly £1 million a year to America for motion pictures. The extent of this industry in other countries can be gleaned from the fact that approximately £400 million have been invested in the industry at Hollywood, where 325,000 persons are directly employed. And for some years, the industry ranked second to the great steel industry of America, and today ranks third to the great steel and oil industries of that country. With the advent of the production of sound pictures, greater opportunities are opened up on the production side in Australia, because with the coming of the talkie, the spoken word, good English, typical Australian characters mean very much more than they did in the days of the silent film. FT Film Studios rightly expect to be able to produce sound pictures of such a high standard as will enable them to get a worldwide release. It has been truly said that trade follows the film. It is certainly a wonderful advertising medium. It should be quite possible for us to produce here in Australia approximately, say, 50 feature films a year at a cost of £8,000 each. That would mean £400,000 spent and circulated in this country. With the production of sound pictures, new opportunities are opened up to our Australian writers, actors, actresses, and musicians. These artists have excelled themselves in other countries of the world. There is no reason why they should not do so here in Australia. And I wish to say, in conclusion, that I wish FT Film Studios every success in the great work they have undertaken. And I sincerely hope that this Digger comedy and other pictures about to be shown will be given such a generous measure of support by Australian audiences as will give the necessary encouragement to their enterprising proprietor, Mr. Thring, so that he will continue the good work and build up this industry to such a high standard as will allure the best brains even from other countries. In conclusion, I wish this program every success.
So there we go. Frank Ford, a man ahead of his time, and shows you what Australian creative industries have been doing for nearly 100 years. So I hope you enjoyed that. But now I'd like to hand over to John Graham to act as the moderator. But before he does, I just would like to thank Paul Murphy and the MEAA also for their help in putting on this event. So over to you, John.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brett. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. I also want to acknowledge I'm on the land of the Gadigal people and pay respect to elders. Thanks to our special guests for joining us. It's fantastic to have Rachel, Michala and Martin here with us. We're going to work through pretty quickly, and there will be the chance for question and answer. So if you do want to pop a question in the chat, we'll work through and get to some of those later as well. That's a remarkable piece of cinematography, though, and a great introduction to a comedy film I now want to see from a former Labor Prime Minister. We might start off with Michala, though, just talking about how difficult this period's been. I think that's probably the right place to start. This has been such a difficult year for everyone. It's an unusual meeting. As you've talked to people across the arts and cultural sectors, what do you think is the thing that's hit people the hardest?
Look, to be honest, losing all of our work. I lost all of my work in a 24-hour period for the foreseeable future, and losing work means no income. So the financial loss has been immense for my colleagues. We're contract to contract workers. I mean, our crew often, work long periods of time, but for the most of us, we're working in sort of short increments from contract to contract. And not only did we lose all of our work, we lost all of our future foreseeable work, plus any kind of for the people who are not at a place where that's their full-time job, they also lost their supporting work. So, working in cafes and working in the box office, et cetera, et cetera. So casual work was gone. So I think, John, the biggest loss has been a financial one, just for all the workers in our industry. And then to look at the bigger picture for some of our networks and our theatres, that loss has been huge as well.
And Rachel, I might ask you the same question, just what has been the hardest thing for people? This is a really networked part of our society. People are working alone often, but in big networks talking to each other. As you've talked to people, what have you heard?
Look, obviously I'm in an incredibly privileged situation, having worked internationally over the last 20 years I'm very aware that I'm a rare person in my industry to have the buffer that I have. But of course, many of my closest friends are artists, theatre practitioners, technicians, working in film. So I think it's, listening and trying to advocate and trying to get through. And then, as a content maker, as somebody who across my content is always really trying to make sense of the moment that you're in and catch the zeitgeist, not to be cool, but because you're trying to make meaning of the world that we live in, the Australia that we live in. It's been a very overwhelming time to think about what kind of content can meet the moment, from big sweeping political things that are coinciding, with COVID, the fall of the city on the hill, if you like, democracy. If one hopes that functioning democracies will be the best way to support a moment like this, they all seem to be fragile, which of course causes a lot of anxiety. And also as a woman, I'm very aware that, this bloke-led recovery may very well leave out those who have been most affected financially, which is women and our minority seasonal workers. So it's just really hard to make sense of, and to try to stay in a place where you are working to make sense of, because there's certainly days where you just, I think, even as a content maker, you want to put a doona over your head.
Sure, there's been plenty of that, and we will. I want to come back to some things that might have given us hope in this period, but I'll ask Martin the same question. Martin Foley, I do consider you one of the nation's great entertainers in your role, but you're obviously talking across the sector in Victoria. What are you hearing from the people you're talking to?
Well, look, I think it's well established that performance in particular, but for the sake of a wider definition, the creative sector was hit, was in fact poleaxed, as Michala has indicated, overnight and almost completely, and shows the longest tail in any prospective comeback. I think it was, the ABS showed that within the first month, over 53% of entire arts and cultural sector businesses had not just taken a hit, they had shut and stopped trading. And subsequent work by the Grattan Institute a month or two later, so into May, talked about that figure rising to 75%. And that's everything from, as Michala has indicated, a sector that is the original gig economy, right? This is a precarious, by its nature, workforce. And if you had to design a package that sought to avoid the employment nature of this sector in its wider sense when it comes to support, as important as JobKeeper has been, it would be JobKeeper. No one is saying that JobKeeper has not had a big enough role, and the fact that, you know, a Conservative government, after pressure from the ACTU and industry and Labor opposition, came to that point has been critical. But it has been the poleaxing of the creative sector so totally and so devastatingly that has been the most brutal thing for me. It's said a whole range of things. There's the survival and the recovery arguments, but there's also an opportunity for some deep reflections about the nature of the employment in the sector, the power and the organisation of the sector, the advocacy of the sector, and a list of reform opportunities that, when we come back, it will be a very different comeback, but we cannot just reimagine where we were. We have to imagine something different.
And there's some big opportunities there, which I think we should definitely try and explore tonight. Michala, I might ask you though, that what Martin suggests is JobKeeper and other assistance has missed the mark, and it really is because of the sort of work people are doing. How big an effect do you think that's had on the ground? How many people are missing out?
Well, look, most of the people I've spoken to definitely can't get JobKeeper and are struggling to access JobSeeker. So, you know, I mean, our workforce employs 600,000 people. That's more than mining. You know, there's a lot of us. We're not this niche kind of elitist thing that's over there. We're workers.
Well, I think tragically it was bigger than mining. It's now, the fall has been so big right now that's for the first time no longer the case.
That's exactly right. And so the fallout's been huge. And I think there's a big issue around, yes, we're suffering financial loss. And these are people who have families and children and extended families to support and take care of. But what that does to everyone's mental health, you know, across not just our industry, across all the industries that are taking a blow financially, that takes a toll on the mental health of those people. And I mean, I don't know what the numbers are of people who can access JobKeeper and JobSeeker from our industry, but it's very low, and there's people are scared, and rightly so, because they don't know how they're going to survive. A massive portion of our industry already live in poverty, literal poverty, and so for them to now, people who live and survive week to week, to now have absolutely nothing coming in is quite terrifying, to be honest.
And what's it meant for some of the people we're talking about, performers, writers, artists, to be at home? Maybe Rachel, is this, in this moment, a lot of us have been at home. I've been coping with the homeschooling, not very well. But for the sort of creatives, has it been a moment of creativity, or is it really coping with the day-to-day at the moment?
Well, I think those of us who can sleep at night because of the privilege of our position, or the luck, or family wealth, or you know, because I certainly had many years in the early part of my career where I was living day to day and week to week, and was incredibly anxious about the next job. And, you know, many in my industry, you know, have, despite the seasonal, you know, insecurity of the work, have mortgages and are looking to lose their homes. So for those of us who, I don't think you can be creative if you have existential concerns. It's a kind of part of your brain, particularly in my business of writing and, you know, thinking of ideas. It's, you know, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is up in the pointy end. So those of us who have been buoyant by the injection of development through Film Victoria, thank you, Martin, the money that's been kind of pushed through from Screen Australia and the state agencies to fund the thinking through this time. I have no doubt that some extraordinarily good television and film content will come out of this. Some already has, you know, even in a kind of COVID form, which has been quite brilliant. Artists make the most of downtime, and I think we do struggle to make sense of the world. So look, I think great things will come out, but, you know, when will the cinemas open? When will the theatres open? Yeah. When will, you know, which organisations will still be there to deliver these stories, these performances to audiences is, you know, still very unknown.
And do you think there's a risk at the moment we might lose significant parts of the cultural infrastructure in the country? Is that a risk right now?
I think it is. Look, I think we're very lucky in Victoria to have a government that sees us as economically, as an economic engine to the state, not just, you know, we're not just entertainment and entertainment services. We are a huge, you know, creative industries is a huge part of what makes Victoria kind of unique and special. I feel like that message needs to, you know, be louder on a federal stage. We all as Australians, you know, claim the international successes and we claim the films that, you know, sing. But it has been, I think, quite gut punching to so many in the arts to see when, you know, the shit hits the fan, where or how we're valued. I think that's been quite a reckoning.
Yeah, no, agreed. I might turn to Martin at that point, partly to answer to pick up on that point, but partly to answer a couple of questions we've had from Ipso Facto Productions. What are the governments going to do to support independent practitioners, not just the major companies and government agencies? And also from Marion Jacker, how do we explain, and I think this is a good question, how do we possibly explain the government's indifference to the struggle at the moment by arts professionals, what's going on? So I might just ask you about those government assistance questions more broadly.
Okay. Thanks, John. So there's not a consistent pattern across the country, I've got to say. There were some signs of that being a prospect early in the crisis. There was a rash of industry and government roundtables, and then a coordination at a national level didn't eventuate, and it was every jurisdiction for themselves. And Rachel's very kind, and in Victoria, we've been focusing on a couple of things. A survival package for those organisations right across the creative sector that we have a stake in, sometimes simply as a state level, sometimes jointly with the Australia Council, sometimes with commercial partners, a whole raft of things, plus our own state cultural entities. And we've done a range of things around that to try to fill some of the gaps that Michala's talked about through some of the mechanisms that Rachel's talked about. So, for instance, we've got 3,500 casuals in our own state cultural institutions. JobKeeper specifically excluded state organisations anyway, but we then designed a package that picked up the casuals. They're also, a lot of them, as people have indicated, creators in their own right who do various things. We've done stuff like a couple of packages around sustaining creative workers to get them to do the kind of thinking and engagement that Rachel's talked about creating work. We've done stuff around bringing forward development in the film sector, in the screen sector, in the digital sector. But what we don't have is a bringing together of all of what the states, the Commonwealth and the sector can do in a kind of coherent national approach, which what is a national crisis. And as Michala's indicated, Victoria alone, depends how you measure it, but we say our creative sector is worth at least 23 billion, well, pre-COVID, was growing at twice the rate of the rest of the economy, was employing a whole range of people. So it's big, but it's also culturally and
so that's pretty encouraging from a Victorian point of view. But what is going on federally that this obvious crisis just has not been able to be resolved? You're round the table in some of these discussions.
Look, it's not through lack of effort by industry. It's not through lack of advocacy. It's just in the, as someone indicated, I think it was Rachel indicated, that when the shit hits the fan, it's where the sector is seen in a comparative sense. Now, that's a political and values judgment at one level, and that has to be taken up and combated against. But it's also a reflection on those of us who support and those of us who are in the creative sector. Think of how is it that such an important and significant sector doesn't have that advocacy punch and recognition? What is it that's held it back? Is it because we're disparate and disorganised, or is it because it's feminised, or is it because it's whatever it is? We've got to cut through that issue, but we've also got to cut through the where do we sit in the relative political judgment and pecking order of what's seen as a significant sector. And
So
we're not doing well in that debate.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question. I might ask Michala and Rachel to respond to that. Feel free, by the way, if people can keep shooting questions through on the chat, we'll put them through. But how, I think we've all had the experience of talking to people and persuading them of the importance of arts, of culture, of music. These things are very important to us. Michala, then Rachel, how do you persuade people? What's the way you found that actually gets across the importance of this?
I mean, I would just say, sit down in your house, have a look around, remove your television, remove your artwork, remove your stereo system, remove all your books, remove your photographs, potentially remove your clothing. They were designed by a designer. Some of your furniture is designed by a designer who's creative. And then have a look around and how's your life? I mean, honestly.
I'm persuaded, Rachel.
I think that's actually a really good ad. Martin, can we get
I'll do it.
a COVID-ready ad, just where we start someone, a nice Australian, a nice, middle-class Australian, but might think the arts are a bit elitist, and just take away the creative industries and see the sad Eastern European circa 1962 grey of their life. Look, I wonder if we didn't make enough fuss when the Department for the Arts was axed. I think I don't know if kind of losing the brain drain and how much muscle they would have been able to communicate, but I think that we kind of did take that lying down. It was a kind of gut punch at the time, but I think, they say one day they'll come for you. I think we could have galvanized around that. I think, I think there's issues in particular aspects of journalism that, by still kind of talking about us being in the arts, has not acknowledged the economic contribution. I think some people are doing fantastic work around the world on this, on Instagram. And I think what's happening at the moment, because a bigger movement is happening, which is, the historic address both in this country and globally around the Black Lives Matter. I think many of us also feel that now is not the time to speak to, the disadvantage that the workers in the sector who unfortunately are mostly white. And I will say that's an interesting kind of reckoning for us as well, that it's hard for us in this moment to assert our privilege when we've also been confronted across all our institutions with how white they are, which is something that I think we're also all taking on board in a very deep way with the work we do and who we do it with and how we will move forward from this moment. Did that answer much of your question?
Yes, no. Well, that's right. You took us on a bit of a journey there, but I think surely that's especially important for arts and culture in Australia too, to be able to actually evolve a way of telling those stories in Australia to the world that acknowledges those issues that you're talking about that are now front and centre. I don't know, Martin, if you've got any views about that at the moment.
Well, I just saw one of the comments run by on the screen that is, to be brutal, spot on. And that reflected the ANU Another Way in the Humanities Department, and ANU work, a humanities think tank that's trying to put forward in the cultural and creative sector a whole range of other foundation documents to inform this conversation. Over the last decade and a bit, particularly over the last 6 years, the investment in the wider cultural creative sector at the federal level has been reducing. It's been going up in the states, and very interestingly, it's been going up in local government, and it's been going up across the commercial and cultural sector. What we're lacking is investment and support, whether it's in the funded subsidised sector, which is what some call it through the Australia Council and others, or whether it's in support from industry itself as to how it engages in what is a very global industry, and when given even a half chance, Australians are ridiculously successful at. What we're now seeing is, after those several years of substantial reductions and overall reductions as a result, that the sector has been weakened. And Rachel identified the loss of an identifiable part of government at the national level that is responsible and leading that. that is the end result of a series of political and cultural choices to devalue government's leadership in this space. And if the COVID emergency has shown us anything, it is government, the public sector, the role of government to lead is fundamental to our existence and our survival, and has been the fundamental part of how we've been successful in dealing with the health side of the curve here. What we haven't been so successful is what does the economic road to recovery look like? And this sector needs to be a fundamental pivot, fundamental pillar of that comeback. And it can be, but it needs us to get organised at a government level.
Yeah, well, one of the gaps, and this is one of the questions here from Michael White, and I might put it to you, Martin, given that view, is why is there not a creative industry, arts or culture committee on the COVID-19 Commission? Why isn't it integrated at that national level? Is that an issue that has been discussed nationally?
Well, yeah, I don't want to. I don't think national cabinet's covered by cabinet confidentiality, anyway, is it? But I know it's been proposed. Interestingly enough,
let's find out.
To give the South Australian Premier a shout out, who is also the South Australian Minister for the Arts. In the hookups we've had, he has been a pretty passionate advocate. So I know it gets onto that national agenda, not just from the team that I bat for, but through a Liberal Party Premier who's also an arts minister. But it hasn't got the support at that collective political leadership level, particularly at the Commonwealth level, that's required. It's not to say that it's not recognised, but it's just got to have a punch through that for whatever reason, and it's not necessarily the sector's fault, although we've got to think about how we reorganise in the future, but it's that, I think Michala talked about it, it's seen as a soft, not real industry. And why is that? Because it's feminised, because it's casualised and precarious, amongst other things. But it's huge and getting bigger, and just takes screen in its own right. The demand as a result of COVID for screen content globally was big beforehand. It's gone off the dial. We are so well positioned to make the most of that. And we could be doing it. We could be taking steps right now. I'll get Rachel to say this because she says it a whole lot better than me. Where else would you want to make movies in the world?
Well, I take that pitch in the Frank Ford tradition.
Yes.
Rachel, do you want to chip in at that point, just about the future of particularly the film side of things?
Look, what will certainly, hopefully lead us out of this sector, and many of my industry colleagues are kind of collaborating and trying to move things forward on this, but particularly if we're looking at a second wave, which I think America is waking up to now and Europe very shortly, is that Australia and New Zealand are uniquely positioned to offer somewhat of a buffer of a more dependable place for production. We have an incredibly fantastic medical system to also offer guest production. So in an ideal world, I see us attracting billions, and one American television show can be from 100 to 130 million. So billions over the next few years, with perhaps a trans-Tasman bubble. I've been talking to producers in America about the opportunities of shooting here, but it needs to be a very national strategy. Obviously has to be coordinated with Home Affairs. What are we saying? You charter a plane, you bring everybody in, your children can go to our schools, you will have access to our hospitals, perhaps not for that knee replacement, but for COVID related illness, you quarantine, and then you can make your full season of television, which the show that I'm talking about would be close to 120 US. So it doesn't take many of those productions to have a huge impact on our domestic economy, offer jobs to our highly skilled technicians who at the moment you know, there are many of our technicians who do travel and work internationally and come back, and they've also been grounded by COVID. Many of our top directors and cinematographers have come home for COVID. So they're here, they want to be here with their families, and we have a huge opportunity to take advantage of that. But we need, you know, to move forward. There are talks happening in the next few weeks over that. But
yeah, no, that's really
think
exciting.
Billions, billions could be brought in. And
one of the things that there's a couple of questions about, and I might put this to you, Michala. People ask, including Larry, asking, is there a way to, one of the problems here is the sector doesn't have a single unified voice. It's very diverse. It's very disaggregated. It's a beautiful sector, but a whole lot of people working in their own worlds. Is that part of the problem, and how could we do that better? We've got a couple of questions along those lines.
I mean, that's a tough thing to answer. Yeah, I mean,
if you could fix that.
Sure. Wave my magic wand. Yeah, it's tricky because we are diverse. You know, we're not just talking about film and television. We're talking about theatre. We're talking about art galleries. We're talking about stand-up comedians. We're talking about musicians and venue. You know, and we all do sort of, yeah, we are quite sort of separate in a lot of ways. And so I do think that is part of the problem, is that we need to be unified, and perhaps this is the time to do that. Maybe this will spur some more of that. I also think there's this misconception generally about the elitism of our profession. You know, I have a very privileged career, but people assume that I'm a multi-millionaire because I've been working in television for 35 years in Australia, and I'm not. If I was in America, potentially I might be, but there's an assumption around how much money people make in the arts. You know, that we get all this stuff for free, and there's this kind of unrealistic perception of our industry. I think that's a big problem from the public, and that for us to try and, as Rachel touched on, for us to sort of advocate, you know, as someone that you see my face on TV all the time, potentially, for me to start advocating, saying, oh, crying poor, that's not appropriate. But I want to speak for all the people who make up the 95% of my industry who are poor, because 5% of us have the privilege that Rachel has touched on again, you know, of sitting in this really small percentage of our industry that have this success and financial stability, and the rest of them are not. And I was one of them, as was Rachel in my younger years, you know, and I will stand up for them now, because I have to. But in answer to the question about, do we have a unified voice? Probably not. But we have a huge industry that brings, you know, over $111 billion to the economy, you know, or did until pre-COVID. And I'm wondering why yes, I feel somewhat acknowledged, but certainly not, this industry is not valued. You know, we look at the fact that the government gave a $750 million package to the aviation industry a few weeks ago. Aviation industry is a sixth the size of the arts industry. And they got
we've got some comments coming through saying, look, football's back. You know, why are we still struggling with the arts? Of course, this has got to be based on the health advice.
Of course.
The attention paid in government, I can tell you, is much more on the sport than the arts, despite exactly what we've heard the impact is. I want to cut. We've got about 15 minutes before we've said we'll wrap, but I really want to come to that question about what the future holds. It's just been a terrible year for anyone in the creative sector. It's been devastating. What's happened, the hit has been so hard, and it is going to go on for some time. When we rebuild, what is possible? If we don't accept that we're going to have things as they were, we're going to look for a better sector where arts and culture is valued. What do we need to do? What is possible? What's an optimistic future? What what are the good things that we might have learnt out of this as a country? I might ask Rachel, do you want to have a go at that easy question first?
Well, look,
I think each of you, I'd be interested in your view.
You know, without sounding like a socialist, you know, I think this COVID moment has ripped the Band-Aid off the idea that the gig economy is, you know, about freedom for workers. I think, you know, we've got one of the most casualised workforces in the world. In our industry, people have always been casualised, and, you know, we've bridged our every job's, you know, our last job, and, you know, we're pretty careful about you know, about how we, you know, manage that, because we're passionate about what we do. But look, I think the idea of casualisation in our sector it does need to be looked at. I just read today also that 44% of the jobs lost in COVID are people under 25. And we haven't spoken, I think, enough about young people, you know, young artists who, as Michala said, you know, they had their side hustle and their main hustle. They weren't kind of being an artist on the dole. They were, you know, threading all this together. I think we need to reach out to young people and think about them as we design public policy over the next 10 years. And I hope they're loud and noisy about that, as well as climate change, Black Lives Matter, and the other things they care about, because I do think young people have been thrown under the bus, you know, over the last 30 years progressively. They really will have a different life to those who are retiring. Secondly, I think the art sector needs to be much more corporate and savvy in our lobbying. I think our lobbying is very disparate. If we're the tourism industry, we would have very, very centralised, very focused lobbying of all levels of government. And I think this moment has revealed the piecemealness of ourselves in the arts, and I mean hiring like hardcore lobbyists. And also I think some work, and I don't know how this is going to happen, but I think there needs to be work done within journalism, within the financial papers of our financial section, that the arts is part of, seen as a legitimate part of the economy. And I don't think that's going to happen actually until we get our shit together and have a bit more.
Although the Victorian discussion is quite a good clue as to how that might happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So I might go to Martin on that similar question. What's possible as we rebuild? If we don't accept that we're going back to the old world where we feel arts and culture was undervalued, is this a moment where we can argue for something better and fundamentally different from where we were?
Well, it has to be. As Michala indicated, this is a sector where 95% of people scratch out a living in the circumstances that Rachel just touched on. I'm pretty sure this is right. The last ABS stats showed that the average income in real terms, not percentage terms, in actual dollar terms, from the previous ABS census, people who identified as creatives went from the massive average annual wage of just over $15,000 down to $12,000 per annum. Now, for that group, it's gone to zero. So you cannot expect a nation with the kind of cultural opportunities we've got to have that as the average income for a creative sector existence. So it's about survival in the first instance. And the truth is, the devastation of this impact will see many organisations not survive. It'll see many creatives pack it in. For those that do survive, and we want that to be as many as possible, there's a stabilisation period that maybe we're just entering now. But the more important thing is the recovery and the reimagining. And that's built on pretty simple principles that I see. Organising for power that people have touched on. This sector is everywhere. This sector touches everybody's lives. It's organising for resources. It gets support. It gets significant support, but nothing in comparison to what other sectors who successfully argue that they're deeply embedded in the economy and society and culture. And it's organising then for results. And that means all of the kind of things that people have touched on: advocacy, governance, government regulation, community support, education. This is an opportunity, once we get into that recovery process properly, to not lose sight of the fact that from significant shared Australian values around creativity, you can build, as Frank Ford indicated all those years ago, an entire new way of employing and engaging in a cultural product that is uniquely Australian but globally relevant. If Frank Thing can do it in the 1930s, surely we can do it in the 2020s.
Thanks for that. So we might go to, well, firstly, a shout out to our musicians as well. They're the pay rates in general. The average for a musician in Australia, full-time musician, is just $11,000, and that's obviously pre-crisis. So, I think you made a really good point there, Martin. But Michala, on that question about the future, what is possible? What would you like to see change?
Oh boy. Well, funding, more funding, of course, across the board. It would be great if we had tax incentives to bring those more international productions over, like we had in the 70s. That worked a treat, And when I say funding, I mean, across all the sectors, but not just for the big players, for the smaller, more independent companies. I think it's essential that we have public support of our industry. We are the voters, you are the voters, the public are the voters. So to have the support and vote accordingly would be amazing. I think it's absolutely imperative that the Australian content quotas are reinstated for screen. We have to have Australian stories on our stages and screens, and to have those quotas removed was such a kick in the guts, and to be kicked while we were already down. So that they need to be reinstated. I feel like the screen sector is coming back. I have hope. I feel like there already things are starting to come back. Things are in pre-production. I have concern for the live sector, for our musicians, for our stand-up comedians, for our theatre performers and technicians across that sector, because I don't know quite how that's going to work. We're talking about sport and getting 2,000 people in a stadium, and they're saying we can fit more. I know we can fit more, but they have to get in and out of the venue as well. Like, we have to think about social distancing, not just within the premises, but getting to and from, etc. So the live sector is where I have concern, but Aussie content quotas is right up there for me.
Well, it's a fantastic point, and I'll just a big shout out to Fiona, who's also encouraged people through the chat to make a submission. You've got till July 3 to do that. This was one of the things that happened under the cover of COVID, an attack on our ability to tell Australian stories. So it's a really good time to do that. This impacts on the screen side. Obviously, it's also a big debate on the music side of things, as well as on radio and potentially into streaming down the track. But there is a live option. So in the chat is the details of how you can make a submission on that. But I think that is spot on. That is one of the things, one of the fights, one of the things that we can organise for and influence at the moment. Yeah. We're coming up close to the finish time, so I might go to each of you just for a final thought after the discussion we've had. Thanks to everyone who's put in a question, and you'll be able to you can view some of those in the chat if you'd like to look through. Also, before we go back to our guests, a big shout out to Chifley and to Brett and Daniel, who've organised this tonight. Chifley is one of those organisations that really focuses on impact. So not just having these discussions, but really driving these into the political system. So it's one of the great advantages of an organisation like Chifley. It's not just another discussion. This is something aimed at changing how Australia is on some of those big questions that we've touched on today. But final thoughts from each of you. I might start with you, Rachel.
I think I just want to speak to one thing, and it's not just because I don't want people to think we're a bunch of whiners, but I actually do think Australians value our cultural capital and our economic capital. I think Australians have seen how this sector performed, like through a bushfire moment, that we galvanise and are extraordinarily generous in great moments of national crisis. I think that perception of us as, you know, arts wankers is not actually so much a general public feeling, particularly if we're to bring live music, live performers and comedians, you know, into the fold and the television we make. So I think Australians do value what we bring. I think they do value the chairs that we make, the art on our walls, the who's playing at the pub, the TV shows they're watching. I think just what's been quite shocking for us over COVID is how that has not actually translated up. And I do think journalism, particularly in the financial papers, is talking to almost something. I'm so sorry about my dog.
There's no apologising.
I'm so sorry. Should you mute me and I'll go and break up these two
Well, thank
bulldogs?
you for that thought. I'm going to hand to Martin. So you've got a Martin Foley for 1 minute thought.
Yeah, thanks, John. I don't have any dogs in the office. Look, noting the huge devastation and not understating it at all, I am overwhelmingly optimistic because, similar to what Rachel said, there's enough shared values right across the Australian community, right across its increasing diversity, that whether it's newly arrived communities or the first Indigenous peoples of this place, that make, in a service-based economy and future, the cultural, social, and increasingly economic value of what we loosely define in Victoria as the creative industries, central to who we are and what we can and should be in a global linked up world. This is not about hiding behind created barriers, and I totally share Michala's view of the act of bastardry that handed the boards of television stations around Australia a massive financial free kick in the middle of the COVID crisis. But people think they can get away with that because people don't value this. This is an unbelievable opportunity from such devastation to reimagine, reorganise from shared values, a new power and relationship structure that puts creativity at the centre of our economic, cultural and social future. I'm wildly optimistic that there's enough goodwill right across the community, let alone right across the creative sectors, for that to happen. It will be challenging, but it will happen.
Over to you for a 1 minute thought.
Oh, thanks, John. Look, I do want to say I actually completely agree with Rachel. When I said I feel like we're acknowledged but not valued, that was in reference to the government, not the public. And so, yeah, I just hope that the government puts as much value on the arts as Rachel said, as the public and our colleagues do. I'm hopeful as well. But it's been really tough, and I'm not going to pretend it's not been really tough for the majority of our industry. But also, we know better than anyone how to handle this situation. We know how to be unemployed for periods of time. We know how to handle this kind of stuff and be creative in the face of adversity. And so we know how to step up, and I feel like we can and we will. But I would love the government to support that. And I'd also just like to say thanks to Martin and Rachel for their excellent brains. Thanks to Brett Gale at Chifley, and thank you to you, John, for having me. I feel really privileged to have this opportunity to have this conversation, so thank you.
Thanks for that. And now I think it's back to Brett at the home studio.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michala, Rachel, Martin, for fantastic conversation tonight. This is really what we are trying to achieve here at Chifley, to have this conversation that pushes forward public policy debate in this country for the better. So thank you all for a really fascinating evening. I really appreciate it. And thank you, John, for excellent moderating. Thank you all for tuning in. Our next Chifley Conversations event, for those who are following Chifley, will be held next Wednesday lunchtime, where we're looking at the new front line, what workers are on the new front line. So, which obviously are creative industries as well. So please sign up for that next Wednesday lunchtime. But once again, thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Bye.